For my thesis, I developed my own process to make a DMI, which is the globe, and it stands for the Gesture Sensing Luminous Oscillating Ball Environment. A digital musical instrument is a device that uses input from people to control sound. My thesis focuses on instrumental DMIs that are a physical device. Mapping is when a person assigns the sensor data from a DMI to trigger sounds or to control the parameters of sounds. And when choosing your mappings, it's important to keep in mind that you're building the foundation of this feedback loop for the performer. In an interactive system, the performer's gestures are tracked by the sensors in the DMI. It makes sound, and then the performer reacts to the sound. So you don't want to make the mappings too complex so that the performer can understand how their gestures relate to the sound. Interactive visuals, dance, and improvisation are also very common. And to create these DMIs and interactive systems, we have to start with some sort of limitations or constraints to get the ideas going. Most DMI designs start with the intended performer and the performer's limitations. This kind of thinking is what I've done before in past projects. So I thought for my thesis I would make myself approach it from the opposite direction by first systematically thinking about the sensor technology and letting the ideas flow from the different sensors' limitations. This does not mean that the other limitations that come into play can be ignored. It just means that the technology is the point of departure. So for my thesis, I did my literature review, I developed my own process for coming up with design ideas, I made the globe, and I performed with it on a live stream. Since I am the person who made the instrument and performed with it, I recognize that my methods fall under autobiographical design. Before I got started, there are some very general limitations or priorities that I worked with, but I recognize that they aren't specific enough to really ground my mind and use as a starting concept for my instrument design. So for my evaluation of sensors, I first needed an understanding of all the different ways of tracking that are available to me. So as I went through all these various sensors, I organized them by the type of stimuli they sense. There are color and light sensors, IMUs, proximity sensors, touch and pressure sensors, biosensors, and sound-based sensors. And I included other devices like the smartphone and various forms of skeletal motion tracking like PoseNet. And then I made the second group of charts that outlined the general sensor's possible gestures and playing contexts, as well as their limitations. And on the slide here is only a small portion from these charts. I then used the information for the possible gestures and limitations to come up with the ideas for DMIs that used one type of sensor, but I found that keeping it to one type was very difficult. Sometimes I would think of the idea and automatically want to add other sensors to the design. So after coming up with one sensor ideas, I moved on to thinking about ideas that contained two sensor types, then three, then four. I did this with a Max MSP patch that stores and outputs lists of random sensors. And what I found is that with the 3 sensor group and the 4 sensor group, it was more and more challenging to come up with DMI ideas. With the 4 sensor groups, you can see that there were many rows that I left blank because I just couldn't think of anything. So if I were to repeat this process, I would instead start with a random pair of 2 sensors and then see if I could add any other sensors to enhance the design afterwards. So out of all of my ideas, I chose the ball, which later develops into the globe. And I decided to use the Hussar Feather with ESP8266 for the microcontroller, and it's multiplexed, so there are 16 FSRs. The TCS34725 RGB color sensor and color-changing LEDs, an LIS 3DH accelerometer, and a sharp IR or infrared sensor. And here it is soldered to the circuit board. Since this is the first prototype, I used headers and IDC connectors for all the important parts instead of soldering them in directly. To get all the electronics inside the hamster ball, I 3D printed a disc and used twist ties to secure it inside. And I also 3D printed a little stand for the globe. The stand has a slot so I can slide paint chips underneath to activate the color sensor and LEDs. The ESP sends the sensor data from the globe to Max MSP through either OSC messaging or through the computer's serial port. I made a B-patcher in Max that takes the data and divides it into the sensor's individual data streams so I can use it to map to sounds. For the color sensor, it gives a range of data for the values of red, green, and blue, as well as light sensing called clear. So I made a B-patcher that compares the color sensor's values with stored values and will report on the closest approximation for what the color is. I made and performed 2 etudes with the globe. The first etude is minimalistic with one-to-one mappings. It used artificial sounds with the synth drone and carbless strong engine, and the globe was contained to its spinning stand. So I only used the y-axis of the accelerometer and the FSRs to control sounds. The accelerometer changed the filtering for both the carbless strong and the synth drone. In Etude 1, there were 2 ways that I liked to play the globe. When I was only playing with the carbless strong, I liked orienting the globe sideways so I could play the FSRs with my thumbs. And when I played the drone, I turned the globe the other way. Etude 2 has more complicated mappings and uses audio recordings. I had 4 different groups of sounds that are based on color. In this piece, the computer has more autonomy because whenever I pressed any FSR, it would trigger a random shorter sample. Etude 2 uses all of the sensors and many playing techniques, and when using the IR sensor with my hand, I found I like to rest my fingertips on the surface of the globe to prop my hand up a few centimeters away from the IR sensor. I did my best to evaluate the globe from my different perspectives as the designer, the programmer, and the performer. And then when I performed with the globe online, I asked the audience to fill out a survey so I could have their feedback. From the designer perspective, I looked at how effective my idea generation process was and how effective the globe is in its physical design and hardware. I found that since I had previously mainly thought about the performer first, to instead think about the sensors first was a good way to think creatively. There are a few improvements that could be made. The IR sensor does not work as well as it could, so the simplest solution would be to replace it with the time of flight sensor that I have and use an I2C multiplexer to connect it to the ESP. There are 2 FSRs where their data bleeds into each other, so if I am unable to troubleshoot it, a workaround would be to unplug one of the FSRs from the multiplexer and plug it into one of the available analog inputs on the accelerometer. The color-changing LEDs are a good addition to the globe for visual feedback, and there are DuPont connectors in between the LED strips where the strips meet the 3D printed disc. But it would be aesthetically better if there were no separation in between the LEDs. For the next version, I could either 3D print the ball shell or look for a rubbery dog toy shell so it could bounce. As a composer and programmer, I'm evaluating if I am mapping the best sensors to the particular sounds that I chose, as well as how reliable the sensors are. For selecting presets, using the color sensor with color detection was more challenging to work with than I expected. While testing it on the Twister map for Etude 2, it is difficult to program so that it does not accidentally report a false color identification, but it is easier to use when testing it while the globe sits in the 3D printed stand. I mapped an FSR for turning on and off the drone in Etude 1, and that was reliable. However, it is only possible to use the FSRs for presets while the globe is in one of its stands, or if the performer is holding it for the entire performance. While the globe is rolling on the ground, it is too easy to unintentionally trigger a preset. The FSRs are the best choice for any mappings that involve MIDI or exact pitches. On the other hand, the IR sensor is better suited for pitch modulation or pitch shifting. The IR sensor or the accelerometer are also the best suited for timbre modulation. As a performer, I look at general observations that would make the globe easier to perform with. In Etude 1, it is challenging to remember the notes mapped to the carbless strong engine due to the visual layout of the FSRs. Staggering the FSRs could improve this. For Etude 2, it is challenging to remember what the mappings are because they are different for each color. So I had mapped what I felt was the most important parameter for each color to the IR sensor, and then the second most to the y-axis of the accelerometer. So when I performed, I could focus on that. For the audience survey, I first asked them a few questions to establish their musical and technical background. 4 participants have a strong background in music and music technology in their own work. 5 participants are amateur musicians and have seen concerts with DMIs before, and the rest of the participants have not seen concerts with DMIs before, 3 of which are intermediate to professional level musicians. 4 participants are amateur musicians, and 1 was not a musician. And then I asked them questions relating to the instrument and the performance. 1. Could you see or hear the correlation between how the instrument was played and how it changed the sound? If so, was one piece easier in which to identify this correlation than the other? 2. How many ways of playing the instrument, or instrumental technique, could you identify? 3. Do you have any suggestions for other creative playing techniques that were not used during the performance? 4. Could you perceive mistakes in the performance, and if so, what were they? 5. What about the performance did you find most effective? 6. What about the performance did you find least effective? And 7. Any other thoughts about the performance you would like to add? And just some of my overall bigger observations from their answers. A high number of participants said they found that Etude 2 was easier than Etude 1 to identify the correlation between gesture and sound. Also, many participants wrote that Etude 2 is the most effective part of the concert. And I believe that as a whole, the audience gained a basic surface-level understanding of the globe from just being an observer, and they could enjoy and appreciate the performance, though they did miss some fine details. And many participants used the last question to write positive comments about how they enjoyed the performance and think that the globe is a very fascinating DMI. So I think overall it was a good performance and effective instrument from the audience perspective. In future compositions, it would be interesting to combine the globe with interactive projected visuals. I believe the color sensor in particular would be good to map to the RGB values of the visuals. From the audience feedback, many participants also want to see the LEDs clearly, so it would be fascinating to perform in the dark or with dim lighting. It could also be interesting to make the LEDs audio reactive. Audience members also suggested having multiple people play the globe, either with multiple performers or with audience participation. So once it is safe to do so, it would be interesting to explore that idea. I think it would also be interesting to combine the globe with a skeletal motion tracking system. And thank you for listening to my presentation.